The toxic plume of burned vinyl chloride, which we know produces dioxins, which can contaminate soil and our food supply and stay in our bodies for years, that plume was modeled for one burned car. The actual plume, again, was 5 times larger. So, great for Pennsylvania that the EPA is monitoring their soil, but where did the plume actually go? And I'm deeply disturbed by the lack of questions posed by senators and representatives from all over the country, but mainly those from the East Coast, who didn't ask if monitoring was being done in states further east of the site than neighboring Pennsylvania. Did the EPA update their model and track the plume in the following days? Do they know where the fallout landed? On our states? On our crops? On our homes? Out in the ocean? Are they doing any testing further out in these locations where the winds mellowed and the chemicals fell? Questions not posed. So questions not answered. And maybe it's just easier for a politician not to know, because they can't be responsible for addressing a problem if it doesn't officially exist, right?
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 274th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Before I do anything else, I do want to thank you for helping me accomplish a goal far faster than I ever imagined possible. In this part of the last episode, I told you that I had a bit of a competition going on with my own podcast. I host 2 podcasts. I host Congressional Dish, and I also co-host another one called We're Not Wrong. And both podcasts were in a race to 1,000 patrons. And this podcast had about 60 or so patrons left to go. And before the next episode, this episode, I am thrilled to let you know that we hit the goal. We hit 1,000, and I could not be happier. I never expected to hit it this quickly. I mean, it's kind of ironic to say because it took 10 years, but the fact that, 60 people stepped up when I said I had that goal makes me think I should set goals more often. But no, in all seriousness, thank you to every single one of you who is a patron or is sending in paper checks or sending in, one-time contributions. Thank you to every single person that is supporting this show. I'm feeling really good about it today. I'm feeling so supported, and I'm very happy about where we are and that We're Not Wrong to 1,000 patrons. I still don't know why that was so important to me, but it was. So thank you so much for making that happen. And while I'm on the subject of We're Not Wrong, I do want you to go and listen to that show and support it as well, especially if you're someone who would like to hear from me about topics in real time. So for example, we've been talking for the last few weeks about the whole debt ceiling debacle, which as of this recording on May 26th, the government's supposed to run out of money in 5 days and Congress still hasn't done shit about it. And this was something that I predicted when I found out the Republicans were taking the House and when I found out who was going to be in the House. So if you want to hear my opinions on that, We're Not Wrong is where you should go for that information and for anything that you want to hear about in real time. The reason that you should do that is Congressional Dish. It's never going to be the first podcast to report on a story. However, it will often be the most in-depth when I get to a story because I wait until reports are issued and until congressional investigations are conducted to talk about things. I wait until we have answers before I dish on stories. This episode is going to be a perfect example of that. Because at bedtime on February 3rd of this year, a Norfolk Southern Railway freight train headed east towards Pennsylvania derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, which is a small town on the border of Ohio and Pennsylvania. The train had 149 total train cars, and 38 of them flew off the tracks. 11 of those thrown cars were carrying flammable hazardous chemicals, and they caught on fire, resulting in 22 burned freight cars. And so as tired parents got themselves ready for bed, They were stunned by knocks on their doors from first responders telling them that they should immediately evacuate their homes, as should everyone else within a 1-mile radius, as an explosion was possible, an explosion with the potential to poison, injure, or kill them all. People left their homes so quickly that a lot of them even had to leave their pets. Now, I am happy to tell you that that explosion didn't happen, but the risk remained for days, and so on February 6th, the decision was made to burn 5 of the cars that were containing vinyl chloride, which is a chemical that's used to create plastic PVC pipes, and exposure to its gas form is known to increase your risk of liver and other kinds of cancer. But when burned, vinyl chloride releases poisonous chemicals such as hydrogen chloride and phosgene, the latter of which was used as a weapon in World War I. Symptoms of exposure include trouble breathing and vomiting, and then hydrogen chloride is known to cause irritation to your skin, eyes, nose, and throat. As gases, these chemicals do dissipate quickly, but burning vinyl chloride also produces dioxins, which can remain in the ground and stored in our body's fat tissue for years. And so it's not cool for these chemicals to get into our food chain. And this derailment and chemical burning happened in Ohio, and there are many farms to the east of East Palestine. And so in this episode, we're going to get some answers from a bunch of sources, an interview with the head of the National Transportation Safety Board, and highlights from 4 hearings in Congress about the train derailment, along with National Transportation Safety Board preliminary reports and lots of articles from local and mainstream press, all of which you can view for yourself in this episode's show notes, because I don't expect you to take my word for anything. Trust is earned, and the show notes are how I earn yours. But in this episode, you're going to learn how the derailment happened and what regulatory, or I should say deregulatory, decisions made prior to the derailment would have and would not have affected the outcome of this particular derailment. You will learn what Congress is being told about the cleanup and the current toxicity levels in East Palestine and the surrounding communities. And you will hear from Norfolk Southern's CEO and hear for yourself what promises he is and is not willing to make to the communities that were affected by the derailment and resulting toxic smoke plume. And then finally, we'll look at the Rail Safety Act, which both parts of Congress are working on in response to the East Palestine train derailment, which will allow you to judge for yourself, although I will tell you what I think about it. But you can also judge for yourself if this Congress is doing enough, and this will allow you to contact your 3 members of Congress if you want to see more or less put into this bill, which is still far from the finish line. And so let's get started, beginning, of course, with how in the toxic hell did this happen? Well, here's Jennifer Homendy. She is the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, in an interview with journalist Heather Long on March 6th. And in this interview, Jennifer Homendy explains the role of the NTSB.
That is a role that's very important for the NTSB and why we are independent of the Department of Transportation. We are not part of the Department of Transportation because we do conduct federal oversight to see if DOT's oversight of the freight railroads is adequate or inadequate, and we may make recommendations on that.
And so the NTSB polices the railroad police. And here's what the chair of the board said about the derailment that occurred on February 3rd. First of all,
this derailment, as all accidents we investigate, was 100% preventable.
And this preventable derailment was caused by one wheel bearing that overheated and failed on one of the cars. The NTSB's investigation page makes it clear that there were warning signs that, had they been noticed, could have prevented the derailment, including video footage of the wheel on fire about 20 miles before the crash. But it's impractical to expect train conductors to have access to all surveillance footage along the route. However, Norfolk Southern and the other private freight railroad companies that own and operate our largely privatized rail network in the United States have equipped the network with so-called hotbox detectors, which measure the temperature of wheel bearings as they pass by. And the hotbox detectors were showing a clear increase in heat on the train in the miles before the derailment. The first increase showed the bearing at 38 degrees above the air temperature. The next hotbox detector measured the wheel bearing at 69 degrees above air temperature. The next hotbox detector, 103 degrees above air temperature, and the next one, 253 degrees. Here's NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy speaking about those hotbox detector readings.
Once it hit well over 250 degrees, it was time for the train crew to stop, to inspect the axle, to inspect the wheel bearing, and to possibly, in this case, set out the car. But it was too late because as they were slowing and stopping the train, it derailed. The wheel bearing failed. And so there might need to be more conservative temperature thresholds, so that started earlier. Also, something the Transportation Safety Board of Canada has looked at is real-time monitoring of temperatures and data trending from the control center so that they can see the temperatures increase over a period of time. In this derailment, or what we saw of this train and its operations, is that temperature of that wheel bearing was going up pretty significantly over the course of the 3 different wayside detectors. But the crew doesn't see that. So that real-time monitoring and data trending, so that there's some communication with the crew to stop the train and take immediate action, is definitely needed. We'll look at that as part of our investigation as well.
Which made me wonder, what do you mean the crew doesn't see that? Well, Clyde Whitaker answered that question in a March 23rd hearing in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Clyde Whitaker is the Ohio State Legislative Director for Smart Transportation Division, a union which represents approximately 3,000 railroad workers.
Make note that trending defect detector technology, from being in the cab of a locomotive, when we pass a defect detector, it trends to an office like Norfolk Southern in Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't convey to the railroad crews, which is a problem in this incident as well as many others that still continue to this day. What we need as a train crew, which they say they listen, they haven't been listening for quite a while. We need to be notified whenever these trending detectors are seeing this car trend hotter. That way we can keep a better eye on it. It is feasible. The technology is there. Several days after East Palestine, we almost had a similar incident in Cleveland area on Norfolk Southern. The crew, the defect detector said no defects to the crew. The train dispatcher came on and said, hey, we have a report of a trending defect detector on the train. We need you to stop and inspect it. Immediately after that, the chief dispatcher, which is the person that controls the whole railroad, told them to keep going. If it were not for an eastbound train passing them and instructing them, hey, your train's on fire.
Wow.
Stop your train. And we set that car out. They had to walking speed this car 5 miles. So the technology is there. They're just raising and lowering their thresholds to move freight.
Now, it seems stupid and unsafe to me to insert a middleman in another city between the technology measuring the danger and the crew on the train, whose own lives are in danger when those detectors sense a problem. But this example does seem illustrative of why a profit-hungry corporation like Norfolk Southern would do such a thing, so that supervisors can order the train to keep running and prevent overly cautious crew members from slowing down their operations over silly concerns such as their own safety. Which is exactly what Congress was told is going on. And just so you know, FRA stands for Freight Railroad Administration, and NS is Norfolk Southern.
To that point, on July 11, 2022, I filed a complaint with the FRA regarding an unsafe practice that was occurring on Norfolk Southern. Despite existing operating rules to the contrary, NS was giving instructions to crews to disregard wayside detector failures and to keep their trains moving. This meant that trains were not being inspected as intended and that the crews were not able to ascertain the integrity of such trains. This practice remained in place even after East Palestine.
And in the case of East Palestine's derailment, we do know why the decision was made by the faraway supervisors to keep going on a wheel hot enough to be on fire. Here's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas speaking to Alan Shaw, who is the CEO of Norfolk Southern. This testimony was in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on March 22nd.
Why did Norfolk Southern not stop the train then and examine the bearing to make sure that it didn't melt the axle and that you didn't have a derailment? If you'd stopped then, it would have prevented the derailment. So my question is, Why did the second hot box reading not trigger action?
Senator, my understanding is that that second reading was still below our alarm threshold, which is amongst the lowest in the industry. In response to this, the industry has agreed to work together to share best practices with respect to hot box detectors, trending technology, and thresholds.
So when you and I visited my office yesterday, you said your threshold is now 170 degrees above ambient temperature. As I understand it, at the time of the derailment, your threshold was 200 degrees above ambient temperature.
Okay, so let's take a look at those thresholds. So the old threshold, as Senator Cruz says he was told by the CEO, the old threshold was 200. And in response, Norfolk Southern has told the senators that it has been changed to 170. But in the East Palestine derailment, the readings were 38 degrees, then 69 degrees, then 103 degrees, and then 253, which means that the notification wouldn't have been required to be delivered to the crew any earlier. This fix wouldn't have helped a damn thing because the third reading was 103. With a threshold of 170, nothing would have been triggered. Which makes me wonder, why are we allowing the private companies to set their own safety thresholds? Because they are clearly financially incentivized to keep them high so that they don't have to stop the trains any more than absolutely necessary. Isn't it a slap in the face to the community in East Palestine and to all of our communities with train tracks which are put at risk of derailments? Isn't it a slap in our faces that Norfolk Southern's new thresholds wouldn't have prevented the East Palestine derailment? Isn't it insulting that that is also so easily proven? To have stopped the train earlier, the threshold would have had to be 100 degrees. It would have to have been ordered after that hotbox detector, the 103 degree detector. If they waited until the next one, that was clearly too late. And so why are we trusting them with setting standards if they are so clearly insufficient? Because not only is Norfolk Southern allowed to set the thresholds despite their financial incentives, but they are also being trusted with other critical decisions in regard to the detectors as well. Here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
One thing I will mention is that these decisions about the placement of these hot bearing detectors and the thresholds really vary railroad by railroad. And so there needs to be good decision making, some policies and practices put in place.
So the railroads get to determine where the hot boxes are as well, in addition to determining the thresholds. And so here's Norfolk Southern CEO on March 9th telling Congress how Norfolk Southern has changed their company policy in regards to the placement of hotbox detectors.
Senator, the NTSB report indicated that all of the hotbox detectors were working as designed. And earlier this week, we announced that we are adding approximately 200 hotbox detectors to our network. We already have amongst the lowest spacing between hotbox detectors in the industry, and we already have amongst the lowest thresholds.
If Norfolk Southern is bragging that their thresholds are the lowest, that they are the safest, then that tells me that we need national standards set by government, and we needed them set yesterday. You know, the amount of trust that we put in these private for-profit companies time and time again in my research into this was disturbing to me. Because here's yet another example. This is Eric Brewer, and he is the Director and Chief of Hazardous Materials Response for the Beaver County Department of Emergency Services.
Norfolk Southern hazmat personnel and contractors arrived on scene shortly after 11 p.m. At around midnight, after research of the contents, it was decided to shut down fire operations and move firefighters out of the immediate area and to let the tank cars burn. This is not an unusual decision. This decision was made primarily by Norfolk Southern hazmat coordinator as well as their contractor.
Norfolk Southern decided to let the cars burn on the night of the crash. Norfolk Southern told the firefighters what to do. Now, whether or not the decision was correct is beside the point here because I have no idea. But it's the command structure that's disturbing me. It reminds me a lot of the BP oil gusher during the Obama years, when British Petroleum, which was the company that caused the whole fuck up, was put in charge of, everything. BP was trusted with planning for accidents on their oil rigs, planning it turned out that they didn't do. And we had oil gushing into the Gulf for months as a result. BP was then put in charge of the cleanup, which equated to spraying poison to sink, aka to hide, the oil instead of collecting it. Over and over again, the company was trusted to make the decisions. And as I researched what happened in East Palestine, the same pattern of trusting the company, it's impossible to miss in the East Palestine derailment. So here's Eric Brewer again. He is the director and chief of hazardous materials response in the local area of the derailment. And, in this scenario, he is the government official. He's the one who serves the public. But here is what happened the night of the crash and in the days after.
There was a possibility of explosion, and we should consider a 1 mile evacuation. Ohio officials notified us that the 1 mile radius would now be from the leak oil address. This would add additional residents from Beaver County in the 1 mile evacuation zone. Darlington Township officials went door to door, as well as using a mass notification system to advise the residents of the 1 mile recommended evacuation. It was stressed that this was a recommendation, as we could not force residents from their homes. Social media posts began to circulate stating that arrests would be made if people refused to leave during the evacuation. Let me be clear, this was not the case in Pennsylvania, as this was not a mandatory evacuation. Monday morning, we assembled at the Emergency Operations Center in East Palestine. We learned that Norfolk Southern wanted to do a controlled detonation of the tank car in question. We were assured this was the safest way to mitigate the problem. During one of those planning meetings, we learned from Norfolk Southern that they now wanted to do the controlled detonation on 5 of the tank cars rather than just the 1. This changed the entire plan, as it would now impact a much larger area.
Norfolk Southern decided that they wanted to burn 5 of the cars, when the original plan was to burn 1. But you should know that Norfolk Southern's CEO told a different story to Congress. Here's Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma speaking to Alan Shaw, the Norfolk Southern CEO, on March 9th.
Mr. Shaw, when the vent and burn process was being made, who made those decisions, and what was other considerations other than just burning it and letting the material burn off?
Thank you for that question. The only consideration, Senator, was the safety and health of the community. And that decision was made by unified command under the direction of the incident commander.
Who's that?
The incident commander was Fire Chief Drabeck. Norfolk Southern was a part of unified command.
Now, Fire Chief Drabeck wasn't invited to testify, but News 5 in Cleveland, Ohio, combed through documents and emails received via a public records request. And Fire Chief Drabeck said that after heated discussions, that it was contractors that determined that 5 cars should be burned instead of just the 1. When he says contractors, that means it wasn't him making that decision. It was the people hired by Norfolk Southern. And I think you should hear this too. This is a community meeting filmed in East Palestine by the journalists at Status Quo News, who have been on the ground in East Palestine since the derailment happened. If you want to know what residents are saying, Status Quo is the outlet to seek out, and some of their sources are in the show notes for you. They have done excellent work on this topic. But this community meeting took place on March 28th, after the Senate hearings. And you are going to hear questions from members of the community who are off camera, and so I can't identify them for you. But the answers will come from the EPA's on-scene coordinator in East Palestine, Mark Durno. And so here's the first question posed to the EPA.
Why did the EPA allow the burning of 4 additional cars when there was only issue with 1?
Yeah, so we did not authorize that. We are not, that when we're in that phase of the emergency, we don't make that decision. We provide input to those decisions. And what we provided was an adequate, we helped develop the modeling for what the air was going to do when the plan was just to burn 1 car, right? Because that was the original plan. That night, Sunday night, the plan was not to burn 1 car. On Monday, we learned that they made the decision to vent and burn 5 cars. We weren't part of that decision.
And here's the mayor of East Palestine, Trent Conaway, with more information about how that decision was made and by whom.
They blamed it all on the fire chief.
So the fire chief was the incident commander. But no, he did not make that decision by himself. There was 40 people in that room. So, yes, he was the incident commander. So That's who they want to blame. I got his back, and I'll stand behind that man for anything.
And so you can decide who you believe about the decision to burn 5 cars instead of the original plan of burning 1. But one thing that I think is critical information from that clip is that the EPA did the modeling the night before the burn, and their modeling was for burning 1 car full of vinyl chloride. They analyzed the likely size and direction of a toxic plume for burning 1 car when the actual plume was 5 times larger. Now, they had time, as you heard, to change their monitoring plans, but the science around the plume, where it would go, where the chemicals would fall, it wasn't accurate. It couldn't be. They didn't have time to update it when they found out about the change day of. And that's a fact that I couldn't get out of my head as I heard all of this testimony. So here's Alan Shaw, the CEO of Norfolk Southern, on March 9th.
Air and water monitoring have been in place continuously since the accident. And to date, it consistently indicated that the air is safe to breathe and the water is safe to drink.
Here's Deborah Shore. She's the regional administrator of the EPA, also testifying on March 9th.
Since the fire was extinguished on February 8th, EPA monitors have not detected any volatile organic compounds above levels of health concerns.
And the EPA has also tested the air inside of East Palestine homes. Here's Deborah Shore again.
EPA has been assisting with indoor air screenings for homes through a voluntary program offered to residents to provide them with information and help restore their peace of mind. And as of March 4th, approximately 600 homes have been screened through this program, and no detections of vinyl chloride or hydrogen chloride have been identified.
But what about the dioxins? Those chemicals that result from burning vinyl chloride that stay in our fat cells for years? Well, here's Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia speaking to EPA Regional Administrator Deborah Shore.
Why did you wait a month before you started to order the dioxin testing when the community was asking for this? Was that a decision that you made early on that it wasn't critical, or how was this decision made?
Senator Capito, our air monitoring was searching for primary indicators, such as phosgene and hydrogen chloride, immediately during and after the burn. We detected very low levels, which very quickly went even down to non-detect. Without those primary indicators, it was a very low probability that dioxins would have been created. They are secondary byproducts of the burning of vinyl chloride.
Now, these answers have not been received well by the residents of East Palestine and the first responders to the derailment, many of whom have been reporting breathing problems, burning skin, rashes, burning eyes, nausea, headaches, and other new health problems since the derailment on February 3rd. News 5 in Cleveland has also reported at the end of April that urine tests of East Palestine residents are coming back positive for byproducts of vinyl chloride, even though, according to the CDC, toxins like vinyl chloride generally only stay in the body for a few hours, which would suggest ongoing exposure. Also, according to an article written by East Palestine resident Zazua Gaines, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but she wrote in The Guardian that just last week, in mid-May, that there's still a chemical odor in the town, and this is 3 months after the derailment. And she says that independent testing is showing, quote, high levels of petrochemicals and dioxins in and around our homes, unquote. And I have no idea how to mentally process the differences between what I'm reading from the locals and what I heard in these hearings. But I do want to take a second to focus specifically on the first responders in East Palestine, who are reporting health effects as well, who are real-life heroes for responding to that fire despite not having any idea what kind of chemicals they were exposing themselves to. Here's Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio on March 9th.
It is ridiculous that firefighters and local officials don't know that hazardous chemicals are in their community, coming through their community. In East Palestine, you had a community of largely volunteer firefighters responding to a terrible crisis, toxic burning chemicals without knowing what was on them.
And so here's the explanation for why first responders had so little information about the chemicals on the train that was passing through their community. Here's Jennifer Homendy again, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Yeah, so the fire chief, who, upon arrival at the command center following the derailment, had electronic access to the train consist, which is the list of cars and the materials or liquids that the train is carrying. But none of the responders had the Ask Rail app. And that is, you could look up a UN number for a particular car and get the whole consist of the train. It's an app that the railroads developed for helping emergency responders to get information following an accident.
Now, the Ask Rail app was launched in 2014 and provides nearly 50,000 first responders from 49 states, the District of Columbia, and 8 Canadian provinces, with access to information about what type of hazardous materials a train is carrying so that they can make informed decisions about how to respond during a rail emergency. But the app is only effective if the first responders know that it exists and have it on their phones. I have exactly one first responder in my life that I'm close enough to ask about this, and he doesn't have it on his phone. At least not until I told him about it. But we probably shouldn't rely on me to tell America's first responders about the app one by one. But anyway, first responders and residents of East Palestine and the surrounding communities have been getting sick with illnesses that they didn't have before the derailment. And so I imagine it has to be so frustrating to hear that there's no chemicals detected anywhere in these hearings. But one safety assurance given by Ann Vogel, who is the director of Ohio's Environmental Protection Agency, this one assurance I did find compelling. This is from March 28th.
The reason that we have been able to say that the municipal drinking water is safe is based on an Ohio EPA map that pre-exists the derailment. This is the source water protection map. So the municipal well field is right here, if folks can see that big well in the blue. So the derailment happened way over here, 1.5 miles away from the well field. And we know how the water flows. Down this way, down the creeks. So the derailment would not have affected the municipal water source, and we knew that very quickly after the derailment.
But there's also concerns about chemicals in the soil. So here's Deborah Shore, again, the regional administrator of the EPA, and in this clip, she's speaking to Representative John Joyce of Pennsylvania.
We, in the subsequent soil sampling that's being conducted, we looked at the information about the direction of the plume from the vent and burn event and focused that primarily where there might have been aerial deposition of soot or particulate matter. And those soil samples have been collected in Pennsylvania.
And today, what soil, air, and water tests are continuing to occur in Pennsylvania?
Additional soil samples will be collected in collaboration principally with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, the local Farm Bureau, and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental.
But here's where the plume comes to mind. Because the vast majority of tests have clearly been focused on East Palestine, Ohio. And the tests have all been clear according to, everything you just heard. But the pictures of the so-called controlled burn of the 5 cars do show a toxic plume rising high up into the sky. And what goes up must come down. The toxic plume of burned vinyl chloride, which we know produces dioxins, which can contaminate soil and our food supply and stay in our bodies for years, that plume was modeled for one burned car. The actual plume, again, was 5 times larger. So, great for Pennsylvania that the EPA is monitoring their soil, but where did the plume actually go? And I'm deeply disturbed by the lack of questions posed by senators and representatives from all over the country, but mainly those from the East Coast, who didn't ask if monitoring was being done in states further east of the site than neighboring Pennsylvania. Did the EPA update their model and track the plume in the following days? Do they know where the fallout landed? On our states? On our crops? On our homes? Out in the ocean? Are they doing any testing further out in these locations where the winds mellowed and the chemicals fell? Questions not posed, so questions not answered. And maybe it's just easier for a politician not to know. because they can't be responsible for addressing a problem if it doesn't officially exist, right? And this little exchange between Representative Marionette Miller Meeks of Iowa and Deborah Shore of the EPA, this didn't make me feel any better.
I guess my concern is if the EPA's website says that the sampling data hasn't been quality assured, how did the EPA make the determination that the air is safe to breathe when it appears that the sampling data has not been quality assured?
Congresswoman, I'm going to ask our staff to get back to you with an answer for that.
And so when it comes to the consequences for human health of burning 5 tank cars full of vinyl chloride, this is the bottom line. Here's Representative Raul Ruiz of California speaking to Wesley Vins. He's the health commissioner of the Columbiana County General Health District. This conversation took place on March 28th.
And what are some of the long-term health concerns that residents and your providers have?
We've heard a whole wide range of concerns long-term. Certainly cancer is first and foremost because of much of the information that the residents see online and hear, as well as reproductive concerns, growth concerns, hormonal concerns for their children.
Do you think there's a potential with the carcinogens or any of the toxins that it could lead to ailments 4 or 5 years from now?
Yeah, I understand your question. Yeah, so some of the constituents that we have related to this response obviously are carcinogenic. However, we're seeing low levels is really the initial response. So I think the long question is we don't know.
We don't know.
They don't know. So, since the bottom line truth is that the health effects of the derailment and chemical burn is simply unknown, cleaning up the remaining chemicals as quickly and thoroughly as possible is important. Now, unfortunately, as we have covered, there is no attention being paid to the possible effects outside of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and so there is no cleanup happening outside of those states. But in the directly affected communities, the cleanup is being trusted to. Here's Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey speaking to Deborah Shore of the EPA in a House hearing on March 28th.
When did cleanup responsibilities shift from EPA to Norfolk Southern, and what protections were put in place to ensure health and safety of the community during that shift?
Thank you, Congressman Pallone. The transition from the state agency, which has the delegated authority, and every state has an emergency response capability, and so Ohio was on the ground working with the local firemen and other agencies as EPA arrived shortly after the derailment. It is typical in these kind of emergency responses for the state agency to take the lead in the early days. And Norfolk Southern was complying with the directives from the state. They continue to comply, but we've found over time that it's important to have all the authority to hold the principal responsible party, in this case Norfolk Southern, accountable, which is why on February 21st, several weeks after the derailment, EPA issued its unilateral administrative order. On February 21st, we issued a unilateral administrative order to Norfolk Southern, which includes a number of directives to identify and clean up contaminated soil and water resources, to attend and participate in public meetings at EPA's request, and to post information online, to pay for EPA's costs for work performed under this order. EPA is overseeing Norfolk Southern's cleanup work to ensure it's done to EPA's specifications. The work plans will outline all steps necessary to clean up the environmental damage caused by the derailment. And most importantly, if the company fails to complete any of the EPA-ordered actions, the agency will immediately step in, conduct the necessary work, and then force Norfolk Southern to pay triple the cost.
Norfolk Southern is being trusted to clean this mess up. Norfolk Southern is getting to pick which contractors will do the cleanup. Do you think they're going to pick the best ones or the cheapest ones? Norfolk Southern, the same for-profit corporation that is financially incentivized to keep its trains running, is being trusted to make all of these decisions, just like BP. And here's an example of why that's a problem. So in East Palestine, there are two sets of tracks that run side by side. And of course, when the train derailed and the chemicals spilled and burned, it polluted the soil under both sets of tracks. Norfolk Southern, with its power to decide how to clean up its own mess, chose to clean up the soil under the tracks one track at a time, which allows them to keep running their trains while they clean up their own mess. And obviously the locals are pissed about this, because it means that the cleanup will take longer. This means that the poison will get kicked up every time a train goes by on the open track. It's clearly not the best decision for the community. And here's EPA official Mark Durno's response, followed by the East Palestine mayor's response to locals who asked if EPA could force Norfolk Southern to clean up both tracks at once.
So if EPA tomorrow said tear up both sets of tracks, you guys have the power to tell them, like, no, tear them both up now.
We have the ability to order them to do that, yes. If we ordered them to tear up both sets of tracks at the same time, I'm sure we could see them.
They actually did it the smart way. This is my personal opinion. One at a time, because if they would have done both, it would turn into a lawsuit, and for 6 months to a year, we would have just been sitting in limbo because it would have been going back and forth. They have as many attorneys as we do people working in the village.
So Norfolk Southern is empowered to make decisions that benefit them over the local residents' health, and their financial power causes elected officials to cower in fear of their lawsuits. This is just another example to me that corporate power is out of control in this country. How many more examples do we need? And as far as East Palestine is concerned, their battles with Norfolk Southern, they are just beginning. Here's Representative Diana DeGette of Colorado speaking with Deborah Shore of the EPA on March 28th.
Is the EPA intending to use the unilateral administrative order to ensure that Norfolk Southern establishes a health and environmental screening program beyond this initial cleanup period?
Right now, the focus of the unilateral order and our work with Norfolk Southern is to make sure the site is cleaned up. I think the responsibility for that longer-term health effort, I support what Dr. Vins recommended, and that may have to be negotiations with Norfolk Southern going forward.
Obviously, that hasn't started yet.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And if there are people in East Palestine that don't want to deal with any of this and don't want to risk their health and they just want to move out of there, well, here's how it's going for them. Here's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas speaking to Misty Allison. She is a resident of East Palestine, and this testimony was on March 22nd.
Is there any relief being offered now to say, if you make the decision to move your home and to move your family somewhere else, there is an avenue for you to sell your home and get a fair market price for it?
The short answer is, as of today, no. There is not clear-cut explanation or parameters of how you would do that. We've heard time and time again from Norfolk Southern that they're going to make it right and that they're looking into some long-term health care monitoring and assistance and home value protection, but details of that plan have not been disclosed to residents as of today.
And here's perhaps why a plan has not been disclosed to the residents. Here's Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts speaking to Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw. This is from March 9th.
Will you commit to compensating affected homeowners for their diminished property values?
Senator, I'm committing to do what's right.
Well, what's right is a family that had a home worth $100,000 that is now worth $50,000 will probably never be able to sell that home for $100,000 again. Will you compensate that family for that loss?
Senator, I'm committing to do what's right.
That is the right thing to do. These are the people who are innocent victims, Mr. Shaw. These people were just there at home, and all of a sudden, their small businesses, their homes are forever going to have been diminished in value. Norfolk Southern owes these people. It's an accident that is basically under the responsibility of Norfolk Southern, not these families. When you say do the right thing, will you, again, compensate these families for their diminished, lost property value for homes and small businesses?
Senator, we've already committed $21 million, and that's a down payment.
That is a down payment. Will you commit to ensuring that these families, these innocent families, do not lose their life savings in their homes and small businesses? The right thing to do is to say, yes, we will.
Senator, I'm committed to doing what's right for the community, and we're going to be there.
What's right for the community will then be balanced, which is what we can see from your stock buybacks, by what's right for Norfolk Southern.
Since that exchange happened on March 9th, an exchange that royally pissed off Senator Markey, Norfolk Southern has told the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee that it would compensate homeowners within a 5-mile radius of the derailment site. But it has yet to notify the residents of any kind of reimbursement program. And I do think it's worth noting that Norfolk Southern made about $3 billion in profit in 2022. Profit, that's extra money that is passed out to shareholders. There are approximately 2,600 homes in East Palestine, Ohio, with an average property value of $146,000 before the crash. Norfolk Southern could buy every home in the town for approximately $380 million. In other words, Norfolk Southern could buy every home in East Palestine, Ohio at the pre-crash value for less than 13% of 1 year's profit. But we'll have to wait and see what they actually do. But with the way our government is just sitting back and observing Norfolk Southern, as opposed to issuing orders and telling the bad guys what needs to be done, I don't have much faith that the people affected will be properly reimbursed for the harm done to their homes, health, and lives. I'll just tell you straight up, I'm not feeling very good about this. Norfolk Southern is one of a handful of freight railroad companies that own and operate our privatized rail network outside of the Northeast Corridor. And since 2017, more than 22% of the jobs at railroad companies Union Pacific, CSX, and Norfolk Southern have been eliminated. And this all started when CSX first implemented a cost-cutting system called precision scheduled railroading that most other U.S. railroads later copied. Only BNSF, which is the largest U.S. railroad, only BNSF hasn't adopted that model, but they still made a bunch of staff cuts. But precision scheduled railroading is a system based on running fewer, longer trains to reduce the number of crews needed to deliver millions of tons of goods nationwide. By increasing the length of trains, railroads can reduce total trips, cut down on the number of engines and rail cars needing maintenance, and they can manage with fewer employees on their payroll. Here's Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio in his March 9th opening statement.
The company followed the Wall Street business model. Boost profits by cutting costs at all costs. The consequences for places like East Palestine be damned. In 10 years, Norfolk Southern eliminated 38% of its workforce. Think of that. In a decade, they cut more than a third of their jobs. We've seen what the company did with their massive profits. Norfolk Southern spent $3.4 billion on stock buybacks last year, and we're planning to do even more this year. That's money that could have gone to hiring inspectors, to putting more hot box detectors along its rail lines, to having more workers available to repair cars and repair tracks. Norfolk Southern's profits have gone up and up and up, and look what happened.
And here's Clyde Whitaker again, the railroad union guy, testifying to the Senate on March 22nd about the relatively new precision scheduled railroading system.
It is a virus that has plagued the industry for some time with the inception of precision scheduled railroading. Across America, inspections and maintenance is being deferred to expedite the movement of trains. No longer is identifying defects and unsafe conditions the goal of inspections, but rather minimize the time it takes to perform them or the elimination of them altogether.
This is a company with a history of cutting costs for the sake of profit. We know this. We've known this for a long time. This is not the first time we have heard this in testimony. And in regards to the East Palestine derailment, Clyde Whitaker said,
"This derailment did not have to happen, and it makes it so much more frustrating for us to know that it was very predictable. And yet our warnings and cries for help over the last 7 years have fallen on deaf ears, and the outcome was exactly as we feared. Now the result is a town that doesn't feel safe in their own homes, businesses failing to survive, and railroad that prioritized its own movement of trains before the people in the community, as well as its workers. It truly is a shame that the operational changes in place prior to that incident are still in place today, and the possibility for a similar disaster is just as possible. My entire railroad career, I've listened to the railroads portray a message and image of safety first, but I have never witnessed or experienced that truth one single day on the property. For years, I've handled complaints after complaint regarding unsafe practices and unsafe environments, and for almost every single one, I've been fought every step of the way. The truth is, ask any railroad worker, and they will tell you that their carriers are masters of checking the boxes, of saying the right things without ever doing anything meaningful toward improving safety. Their only focus is on the operating ratios and bottom lines, which is evidenced by the fact that their bonus structures are set up to reward timely movements of freight rather than reaching destinations safely as they once were. Actions do speak louder than words, and I assure you that what you have heard and will hear from the railroads today are nothing more than words. Their actions are what's experienced by men and women I represent, as well as what the people of East Palestine have been through. This is the reality of what happens when railroads are primarily left to govern and regulate themselves.
Despite so many warnings, going back so many years, that have been given to railroad companies and union bosses and regulators and Congress. Again, we've heard about all of this already in previous Congressional Dish episodes. It wasn't even that long ago, episode 247. This was the episode about the growth of U.S. railroads. And this is where we talked about precision scheduled railroading. This has been known for a long time. And yet, despite all of these warnings going back years, recent actions have been deregulatory in nature. After the train derailment in February, there was reporting done by the amazing journalists at The Lever about the Trump administration's decision to rip up Obama-era regulations. And I myself brought this up at the time on We're Not Wrong, and so I do want to take a look at what we know now to see if those regulations, had they been permitted to go into effect, if those regulations on the railroads could have changed the outcome in East Palestine. The regulations were governing so-called high-hazard flammable trains, which you may be surprised to hear did not include the train that crashed in East Palestine, despite the indisputable fact that it was carrying 20 cars filled with hazardous, flammable chemicals. Well, here's Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia speaking first to Alan Shaw, the CEO of Norfolk Southern, and then to Jennifer Hamady, the chair of the NTSB, in the March 22nd hearing.
I know that high hazardous flammable trains have more safety regulations. Why would this not have been characterized as a high hazard flammable train if it had this hazardous materials as part of the 149 car train?
Senator, thank you for your question. I'm not familiar with the entire makeup of the train. I know that a highly hazardous train is defined by a certain number of highly hazardous cars in it or a certain number of cars in a block.
Ms. Hamady,
thank you,
Hamady, sorry.
Thank you.
Maybe you can help me with that question.
Yes, the definition of a high hazard flammable train involves class 3 flammable flammable liquids only, and 20 car loads in a continuous block, which would be a unit train, or 35 carloads of Class 3 flammable liquids in a mixed freight train. That was not what was on this train. There were some that were flammable liquids, Class 3 defined flammable liquids, but this train was not a high hazard flammable train.
Right, it wasn't a high hazard train, but it had high hazardous materials, obviously very flammable, that just lit up the sky. So
that's right.
Is that something that you would consider that should be looked at as a safety improvement?
Yes, Senator. We think that the thresholds of the 20 and 35 should be eliminated, and we think a broader array of hazmat should be in the definition of high hazard flammable train.
Which is not something that any administration has so far tried to do. Instead, in 2014, the Obama administration proposed improving safety regulations for trains that meet the weak definition of a high-hazard flammable train. The Obama-era regulators wanted new regulations requiring rail cars carrying hazardous flammable materials to be equipped with electronic braking systems to stop trains more quickly than conventional air brakes. Norfolk Southern itself had previously bragged about this new braking technology, known as electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, for their, quote, potential to reduce train stopping distances by as much as 60% over conventional air brake systems, unquote. These new brakes are better because the vast majority of the nation's trains continue to rely on a braking system first developed in 1868 during the Ulysses S. Grant administration. And the trains equipped with these Civil War era brakes stop the trains from front to back, while the ECP brakes, the new ones, stop each rail car individually, all at the same time, which stops the train much faster and prevents the cars in the back from slamming into the front cars, piling up as the fast-moving back cars slam into the slowing ones in the front. Basically, the old brakes make emergency stops more slowly and with higher rates of damage than trains equipped with the new ECP brakes, according to both safety advocates and the Federal Railroad Administration. And so this regulation is a no-brainer. But the rail companies' lobbying group used their paid influencers in the halls of Congress to push for the rule's repeal, telling regulators that it would, quote, impose tremendous costs without providing offsetting safety benefits, unquote. Now, despite the clear bullshittery of the claim that replacing Civil War-era brakes with brakes that can stop each car at the same time would not provide substantial safety benefits, the Trump administration changed the numbers to fit the railroad's desired conclusion. Because while the Obama administration had estimated that the rule would save more than $1 billion by preventing derailments, the Trump administration presented new calculations that cut the estimated benefits by a third. And as far as costs are concerned, the Federal Railroad Administration estimated that the new braking systems would cost about $500 million to install. But the railroad lobbyists claim the brakes would cost 6 times as much, approximately $3 billion. And so with lobbyists roaming the halls of Congress telling lawmakers these new numbers, and with people in the rail industry donating more than $6 million to Republican campaigns while making these requests, in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded part of that rule aimed at making better braking systems widespread on our nation's rails. And the Biden administration hasn't done a goddamn thing to try to reinstate the brake rule or to expand the kinds of trains subjected to any kinds of tougher safety regulations. And so, on February 3rd, a train with 20 cars filled with hazardous flammable chemicals, which was not classified as a high-hazard flammable train, rolled through East Palestine, Ohio, and an NTSB spokesman confirmed to the lever that the train did not have ECP brakes installed. And while attempting to stop using the Civil War-era brakes, 38 of the cars derailed, starting with the 23rd car. But would the ECP brakes have made a difference if they had been installed? Well, here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Electronically controlled pneumatic brakes don't prevent a derailment. It could lessen damage. So let me explain that. So in this one, car 23 still would have derailed because the wheel bearing failed. So car 23 still would have derailed, still would have been a derailment, still would have been a fire. And the responders and Norfolk Southern and the state and locals would have had to still make a decision on whether to vent and burn the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars. There could have been a possibility of less damage, meaning a few cars could have remained on the track later in the train. Okay. But as for most of the damage, that still would have occurred with whether we had ECP brakes on this train or not.
So fewer cars may have derailed. It may have limited some of the damage. But with the way that this particular train was configured, with the chemical tanks lined up next to each other, it wouldn't have made a big difference here. But in another instance, having fewer cars derail, I think that could make a difference in the future. So I do think that regulation, despite it not making a huge difference in East Palestine, I think it's still one worth pursuing. But learning the lessons of East Palestine in particular, it seems that stopping the derailment itself, stopping the wheel bearing from failing before the train could be stopped, that appears what could have prevented the East Palestine crash. And Norfolk Southern and the other private for-profit companies entrusted to own and operate our nation's rail infrastructure are trending in the wrong direction in that regard. Here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
The numbers are trending upward on accidents overall, and also for Norfolk Southern.
And so what is Norfolk Southern doing about their upward trend in overall accidents? Well, here's Alan Shaw, the CEO of Norfolk Southern, testifying to the Senate on March 22nd.
Senator, we think about safety every day. We spend $1 billion a year in capital on safety, and we have ongoing expenses of about $1 billion a year in safety. And as a result, over time, derailments are down, hazardous material releases are down, and injuries are down. We can always get better.
So they're lying about it. They are telling Congress that their derailments are down, while the National Transportation Safety Board is documenting the exact opposite trend. Trust. Our nation is trusting these companies. Perhaps we should stop. Because here's Jennifer Homendy, again, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
And we have over 250 recommendations that we've issued on rail safety generally that have not been acted upon yet.
Which is why an actual law from Congress is necessary. Now, the good news is that both parts of Congress are working on a bill that they hope will become law, a bill named the Rail Safety Act. And let's be very clear about this before I give you the details. This bill is very far from becoming law. It's pretty much at the beginning stages. And so the version that I read is the Senate version, because the Senate is, quite frankly, where the grown-ups are in this crazy Congress, and where the effort seems to be, based on the hearings I watched, to be a genuine and bipartisan effort. I was happy to see that there really wasn't any political nonsense in any of these hearings. But the main author of the Senate version is a Republican J.D. Vance of Ohio, which makes me think that his version does stand a chance, even in the Republican-controlled loony bin of a House of Representatives. And the Senate version has also already passed through a committee. And so here's what's in the Senate version as of, the end of May. So the bill would allow, but not require, the definition of high hazard flammable trains to be changed. The changes would be up to the Secretary of Transportation, which, in my opinion, is a nothing burger of a provision because there's no reason why Secretary of Transportation Pete can't order the definition to be changed now. And there's also no reason why the next Transportation Secretary couldn't just change it right back. This definition needs to be cemented in law. And this version of the bill wouldn't do it, despite the National Transportation Safety Board directly telling Congress, as you heard, that the definition is a problem and that it doesn't cover enough trains, including the train that derailed in East Palestine. Moving on, the bill would also require advanced notification and information about high hazard materials to each state or tribal emergency response commissioner, which would have to include a gas discharge plan. Now, it's not clear to me if the existence of the Ask Rail app would qualify as advance notification, or if the emergency response commissioners of each town along a railroad would have to receive a fax or something. So I think that definitely needs more details. The bill would also require new standards for speed, track standards, signaling, etc. But again, the details are left up to regulators, which leaves the entire effort vulnerable to being abandoned, as we saw when the Obama-era regulations were killed by the Trump people. And so basically, this is yet another example in the life of Congressional Dish where Congress is not doing its job and is instead leaving the task of lawmaking up to regulators. And so in my opinion, these provisions are not even close to being strong enough. Now, moving on to inspections, the Senate bill would require regulators to create a minimum time requirement that mechanics must spend when inspecting rail cars. But once again, Congress could take the time to consult with railroad workers and the companies to come up with a reasonable standard and cement it in law, but they are instead leaving that up to political appointees in the regulatory process. But in a refreshing break from that pattern, the bill would also tell regulators to establish requirements for heat detectors for rail companies that carry hazardous materials. But this time, a standard would be set by Congress. The standard would be that hotbox detectors would have to be installed every 10 miles. However, the thresholds for action, so the temperatures at which the trains would have to be stopped for an inspection that are currently being set by each individual railroad company, and the, quote, appropriate steps the rail carrier must take when receiving an alert, unquote, that would be left up to executive branch regulators, which again, makes it vulnerable to political fury. But another provision would set a standard, and it's one that this podcaster thinks is absolutely necessary. The Senate version of the Rail Safety Act would require a minimum of 2 crew members per train. And it's important to know that this is in the Senate version, but not in the House's. So this is something that is a controversial provision. Now, in the Senate bill, there are exceptions for short trips on slow trains that have no cars with material that is, quote, toxic by inhalation, unquote, or for high hazard flammable trains, using the definition that the National Transportation Safety Board has repeatedly said is too weak. But for most trains that we are concerned about, the really, really long ones carrying poisonous shit, a 2-person standard is necessary in law because the railroad companies are openly saying that they want to run trains that are literally miles long with hazardous stuff on them with only 1 person on board. Now, when it comes to East Palestine and what happened there, Jennifer Homendy of the National Transportation Safety Board was asked by journalist Heather Long about the effect that staffing had on that crash.
There's a lot fewer people working on rail, especially freight rail. Does the number of people make any difference here?
Well, for this one, as you said, we had 2 crew members and a trainee. They all stay as with every train in the cab of the head locomotive. So I do not see where that would have made a difference in this particular train, in this derailment. One thing we are going to look at is whether any changes in staffing led to any differences in how these cars are maintained or how they're inspected. That is something we will look at.
And I'm glad they're going to look at that, because just using logic, how can 1 person inspect every car on a train that is miles long and do it properly? Come on. In Norfolk Southern, here's how the CEO responded when the topic was brought up by Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts on March 22nd.
His testimony is loud and clear. It would have been worse if there's only 1 person as a crew on that train. Do you disagree with him?
Senator, I believe that we have operations infrastructure on the ground to respond to derailments.
I think you're not answering the question. Okay, it's almost like the last hearing all over again, because I think the evidence is very clear that these trains can be absolutely safer, but that technology is no replacement for human beings. For example, it can't perform the cognitive functions of a conductor and can't collect visual cues during an emergency. 2-person crews make our trains safer, and I wish that you would commit to that today, because I think it's pretty obvious that that is the correct answer. And I just get sick of industry executives talking about supporting the principles of regulation while they lobby against common sense regulations like this one behind the scenes.
So the railroad, we know what they're lobbying for because the senators are telling us, and in front of the American people, they're refusing to commit to having at least 2 whole people on their trains, which is why a provision requiring a minimum staff of 2 in tandem with the provision requiring a minimum amount of time to inspect each car is an appropriate response to the derailment in East Palestine. Also necessary in law are increases in penalties for derailments because the ones we currently have in law are shockingly low. So, for example, for violations of safety laws that railroads commit that result in a death, the current civil penalty is capped at only $175,000 per violation. This bill would increase that cap by 10 times to $1,750,000, or 1% of the company's annual income, whichever is more. So in general, all of the insanely low penalties are increased by that same amount, 10 times the current penalties, or either 0.5% or a full % of the company's annual income, whichever is more. And so, for example, if the East Palestine derailment had killed someone, which it totally could have, the civil penalty for the derailment would have maxed out at over $127 million instead of the current $175,000. The new rate seems like a much better deterrent than what the company would have to pay now. And this is my favorite part of the bill. But the bill is still missing some obvious requests that were made by the NTSB, and this one in particular stands out. Here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Fourth,
Like cockpit voice recorders in aviation, audio and video recorders in the locomotive cab are essential for helping investigators determine the cause of an accident and make more precise safety recommendations. Recorders also help operators proactively improve their safety policies and practices. In the East Palestine derailment, the locomotive was equipped with an inward-facing camera. However, since the locomotive was put immediately back into service following the accident, the data was overwritten. That means the recorder only provided about 15 minutes of data before the derailment and 5 minutes after. The FAST Act, following terrible tragedies in Chatsworth and in Philadelphia, required Amtrak and commuter railroads to maintain crash and fire-hardened inward and outward-facing image recorders in all controlling locomotives that have a minimum of a 12-hour continuous recording capability. This was extremely helpful in our DuPont, Washington investigation. Now is the time to expand that requirement to audio and include the Class I freight railroads in that mandate. In fact, now is the time to address all of the NTSB's open rail safety recommendations, many of which are on our most wanted list.
But one of the things that appear to be standing in the way of all of these common sense proposals is Republicans. And that's not my diagnosis of the situation. Here's Senator J.D. Vance, a Republican of Ohio, and the author of the generally too weak, in my opinion, Rail Safety Act.
Now, I've talked to a number of my Republican colleagues, and nearly everybody has dealt in complete good faith, whether they like the bill or have some concerns about it. And these comments are not directed at them. Who they are directed at is a particular slice of people who seem to think that any public safety enhancements for the rail industry is somehow a violation of the free market. Well, if you look at this industry and what's happened in the last 30 years, that argument is a farce. This is an industry that enjoys special subsidies that almost no industry enjoys. This is an industry that enjoys special legal carve-outs that almost no industry enjoys. This is an industry that just 3 months ago had the federal government come in and save them from a labor dispute. It was effectively a bailout, and now they're claiming before the Senate and the House that our reasonable regulation, our reasonable legislation is somehow a violation of the free market. Well, pot, meet the kettle, because that doesn't make an ounce of sense. You cannot claim special government privileges. You cannot ask the government to bail you out and then resist basic public safety.
I think I like this J.D. Vance guy. But by his own admission, his bill is being changed, and not due to the influence of the residents of East Palestine. Here he is reassuring his fellow Republicans in the markup of his bill on May 10th.
This bill has changed a lot from what I introduced just a few short months ago. We've made a number of concessions to industry, a number of concessions to the rail industry, a number of concessions to various interest groups, which is why we have so much bipartisan support in this body, but also why we have a lot of support from industry.
And so if you want changes made to the bill, now is the time to call your representatives in the House and the Senate, because the industry side is clearly being heard. But before you call, I do think you should hear one last thing from the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. Because the solution here, despite all of the problems we've heard with the railroad companies, is not to abandon rail for transporting things. So here's the National Transportation Safety Board chair one last time with a comparison of our options for moving hazardous chemicals.
Hazardous materials are transported on all modes of transportation. Our aviation system is the safest, but they're limited in what they can transport for dangerous materials. Pipelines can also be safe as well. They have a generally good safety record until one big rupture occurs, but then our railroads also have a good safety record. The train accidents in general per million train miles are going up, so it's trending upwards, accidents. With that said, going on our nation's roads with these materials is not something we want to see. We have 43,000 people that are dying on our nation's roads annually. We have a public health crisis on our roads. Millions of crashes are occurring. So transporting hazmat on our roads would be more dangerous than on our railways.
Railroads clearly have problems, but they are problems that can be fixed. And this is where I predictably go all foamer on you, but trains in general are modes of transportation that we should be investing in the United States. And not just to move hazardous materials and corporate products around, but also people. Rail is a safe mode of transportation for us, too. 43,000 people a year are dying because we are driving cars all the time. There are safer ways to get around, and rail is one of them. But we are trusting private for-profit companies to run the vast majority of our railroads. And we are trusting them to make so many decisions. It's the companies that decide who can use the tracks and when. It's the companies that decide the safety technology and how it is used. It is the companies that decide the notifications methods to local first responders. It is the companies that decide the emergency response actions. It is the companies that decide the cleanup process. It is the companies that decide the victim compensation levels. This is madness. Corporate control is not serving us well, as the residents of East Palestine are learning the hard way. But damn near all of us live within a few miles of a train track. We are all East Palestine. And so even if you live nowhere near Ohio or Pennsylvania, it's in your interest to care about what is happening there. It's in your interest to use your power as a voter to lobby for less corporate control over the railroad system and over disaster recovery in general. It is in your interest to lobby for less corporate control in general. Private companies care about money, not you. Companies are not created to serve you. And that's not because private companies are evil or anything stupid like that, but because making money is why companies exist, especially ones large enough to be bet on in the stock market. They serve their shareholders. And this isn't an issue of good or bad, it just is. And every penny spent on railroad workers and inspections and hotbox detectors is one fewer penny passed out to shareholders. Every penny spent on cleanup is one fewer penny passed out to shareholders. Every penny spent on victims' healthcare is one fewer penny passed out to shareholders. Every penny spent on victim compensation for their homes and businesses is one fewer penny passed out to shareholders. Which is why corporate shareholders who only see numbers in a portfolio demand as few pennies as possible to be spent on those things. Government is the only power greater than the corporation. Although that power dynamic does seem to be shifting more and more, as the EPA's fear of lawsuits demonstrated today. But we still have a government created, at least in theory, to serve the people. And we people have a choice. One choice is that we can just sit back and be silent. We can let Congress do what they will without bothering to contact them or without bothering to vote, and we will get more and more corporate governance. Because the corporations, they're not silent at all. They speak constantly with hired mouths and campaign contributions. Or we can speak. We can call Congress, and we can demand that government start to take its power back from these companies. We can demand that our government be in charge of cleanups, that our government make sure that the job is done thoroughly and in the interest of the people instead of in the interest of the shareholders. And then the company that caused the mess can be handed the bill. We can demand that our government make the rules that the corporations shall follow. Instead of corporations making rules that please their shareholders, our communities be damned. We can demand that our government put in place penalties that are high enough that they really hurt the corporations where it hurts them the most, in their bank accounts, when they hurt us. We can demand government. I am so sick of the anti-government bias in this country because it is making us sick. Literally. People just like you and I, just living their lives, who are going to bed on a random Friday night. We are sick. And we are being told that everything is fine because a corporation is being trusted to hire those who are studying the damage and to provide the research into the results of their own mess. Why do we allow this? Why do we brand government as the bad guy when it's clear who caused the poison here? and in the Gulf of Mexico, and in countless other examples of corporate cost cutting that has cost us our health, our businesses, our homes, and our safety. So many Americans are afraid of our own government, while cost-cutting for-profit corporations run poisons through your backyards. Yes, our government is a mess. I've been documenting it for a decade. But that is not the natural order of government. That's a choice. Government is a tool that is operated by people, and we are choosing to hire people to run our government who promise to tear it apart for the sake of businesses. Gutting our own government is a choice being made so that corporate shareholders can profit. And the ever-increasing stock market, along with ever-increasing wealth inequality, more for those at the top, less for those in the middle and the bottom, that trend is clear. And so clearly, the strategy of those who are convincing us to gut our own government for the sake of business, that strategy is working for those that benefit from it. And aren't you tired of being asked to sacrifice for that to happen? 'Cause I am. And I hope you'll join me in refusing to be silent about it. I want government to police companies. I do not trust companies to police themselves. Because the next community to be poisoned, it could be mine or yours. I don't consider the stock market the most important thing in the world. People are. Corporations serve the stock market. Government serves the people. And it's about time we start treating the government like the powerful tool for the people that it could be. Because these companies need to be policed, and there's only one entity powerful enough to do it. And so don't let them convince you that that entity is the enemy. Your government is not the enemy. Your government is a tool, and every time we allow that tool to be sidelined in favor of corporate self-policing, the greed monsters win. East Palestine lost this time. Next time, it could be you. So what are you going to do about it? Thank you for listening to this episode. Unfortunately, I do not have any executive producers to announce on this episode. But I am still very excited that we hit 1,000 patrons. So thank you very much to everyone who has signed up to support this show. If you enjoy having 5 hearings plus interviews and articles and reports summarized for you in this way, please support Congressional Dish. All of the methods are available for you on the support page on congressionaldish.com. I do not know what the next episode is going to be about just yet, but I do know that it will be released in mid-June. Until then, please go check out We're Not Wrong for my unfiltered opinions about anything that Justin Robert Young wants to talk about. And until the next episode, take care of yourselves, and thanks for listening. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. With the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.